Welcome to the Orchid Advisors and Tom Fox Law FCPA Compliance Training Series. Anti-corruption enforcement across the globe. What is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD? Over 70 other countries have adopted statutes similar to the FCPA. These are based upon the OECD Convention Against Bribery and Corruption and its good practice guidance on internal controls, ethics, and compliance. Some other laws or treatises which discuss international anti-corruption enforcement efforts include texts from the following organizations: Council of Europe Criminal Law Convention on Corruption, OAS Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, the African Union Convention, UN Convention Against Corruption. Nearly every country has a domestic anti-bribery statute, making the corruption of their government officials illegal. Many governments have their own rules on their employees' acceptance of gifts, travel, or entertainment. What is the UK Bribery Act? The UK Bribery Act became effective on July 1, 2011. It was enacted in response to OECD criticism of the British government in its handling of the BAE corruption scandal. This act replaces several different UK laws dealing with bribery and corruption: Public Bodies Corrupt Practices Act of 1889, Prevention of Corruption Act of 1906, and Prevention of Corruption Act of 1916, and abolishes the UK common law offences of bribery and the bribery of jurors. The Bribery Act has several key differences with the U.S. Foreign Corruption Practices Act. These differences include: the FCPA only criminalizes bribes paid to government officials. The Bribery Act makes all such corruption illegal. There is no exemption for facilitation payments under the Bribery Act. The Bribery Act provides strict liability to corporations for the acts of their employees. The FCPA does not. The Bribery Act provides an affirmative defense to this strict liability called adequate procedures, so that if a company has an effective compliance program, it cannot be held strictly liable for the acts of its employees. The Bribery Act makes the receipt of bribes illegal, while the FCPA only criminalizes the payment of bribes. International anti-corruption enforcement efforts in China. China exploded on the world anti-corruption enforcement stage this summer with its very public enforcement action against the British pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline, or GSK. This enforcement action was very different from those in the US and the UK because China enforced its own domestic anti-bribery and anti-corruption laws against a Western company. Some of the highlights of the GSK anti-corruption enforcement action included: public arrest and detainment of GSK China subsidiary senior management, public admissions by GSK China officials that they had engaged in bribery and corruption, regular announcements by Chinese regulators on the status of the ongoing investigation. Within 2 weeks of the announcement of the Chinese investigation, GSK parent apologized for breaking Chinese law. Since the announcement of the GSK investigation, almost 20 Western companies have announced they are under investigation, are self-investigating their Chinese operations, or Chinese regulators have announced investigations. This Chinese anti-corruption enforcement action of its own domestic anti-bribery and anti-corruption laws against foreign companies may signal an entirely new shift in anti-corruption enforcement actions. Thank you for watching this segment of our video training series. Viewers are encouraged to seek professional advice prior to assessment, implementation, or execution.